Hi everyone, I am back and I'm going to read chapters 4 and 5 in this video. Chapter 4 starts on page 33, so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to flip to that page and then I'll start. Shiloh was adopted 3 years after Peter's passing and after they'd suffered a handful of miscarriages and endured dozens upon dozens of doctor's appointments. Their marriage had taken on a new hue since the baby passed, a shade of blue that seemed to color every room they inhabited, a cloud that smothered the sun. When they made love, it felt accidental, apologetic. When they kissed, it was with cool, tightly pursed lips. Peg's presence at St. Olaf's Lutheran Church, Lyle sensed, was as much in mourning as in observance or celebration. Other parishioners, kind, well meaning people, would stop her as she and Lyle left the narthex for their parking lot. Oh, darling, they would say, we just feel awful for you both. How terrible. And Peg would bravely suffer their sympathy, only to realize her sadness in the car as they drove home, falling into a Kleenex and stomping her feet against the rubber floor mat. It was during this time that Lyle lost his faith, though he sat in his customary Sunday pew just the same. But oh, how he resented it. And, like water seeping into the crack of a great boulder, he gradually began working on Peg, trying to erode her connection to the church, her faith as well. We don't have to go to church today if you're not up for it, he would say. In fact, I don't care if we ever go back, or I don't think it's helping. It's just one more reminder of Peter for you. We should go biking or take a hike, canoeing, anything. I think we'd be better off worshiping in the church of nature. But it was at church where they were told of Shiloh by one of Peg's friends, who pulled them aside after the service, telling them of her 15-year-old niece who'd just delivered a baby in the women's bathroom of an Indiana McDonald's and was now staying with relatives about 50 miles away from Redford because her community would not have supported her, would have, in fact, ostracized her. Her family, principal, teachers, church, guidance counselor, friends, and fellow students. She'd hidden the pregnancy from everyone beneath ever baggier clothing, and in the moments after the birth, alone in that loud, dirty bathroom, and later hiding at a friend's house, the young mother recognized that she couldn't care for the baby and was willing to give it up to adoption. So she lied to her parents, pretended she was going on a Christian youth retreat, and instead bought a Greyhound bus ticket bound for Wisconsin, where her beloved aunt and uncle lived, the only two people in the world she trusted. She showed up on their doorstep with a day-old baby, bedraggled, exhausted, and afraid. Where is she? Peg asked, panicking. When can we meet her? Her friend ran a hand through her hair. The sooner you can get there, the better. The poor dear is running out of time. She's got to get back home before her parents start asking questions. So they went straight to their car in the parking lot, Peg darting for the driver's side as she nearly never did. Get in, she said without looking at Lyle. He did what he was told, glancing at his wife out of the corner of his eye. She took the roads quickly. It was early winter, just before Christmas, and the sunlight off the white-blue frozen fields blinded him. Accustomed to doing the driving, he didn't know what to do with his hands. He opened the glove box and fumbled with a stack of road maps, a tire pressure gauge, a broken pair of sunglasses, a plastic container of orange Tic Tacs. I know you've given up on that you're not sure about God anymore, Peg said. But here's the thing, Lyle, and you listen to me. I'm not so sure you're right. I'm not saying that you're wrong or that you're wrong for feeling the way that you do. If I could have seen God after Peter died, why, there's a good chance I would have killed him. But I have a feeling about this girl we're going to see, and maybe it was all a very winding path, some kind of elaborate plan leading us here to this day, to being in this car and going to find her. She reached for Lyle's hand. I need you, she said. I need you right now more than ever. She looked at him with an intensity he could not recall. He took her hand. I'm here, he said. I'm with you. The aunt and uncle of the young mother lived in a home that looked very much like so many others in Wisconsin, a three-bedroom 1950s era ranch on a straight, ash tree lined, middle class street. When they were welcomed inside, the smell of sloppy Joe sandwiches and apple pie greeted them. It was meant to be a proper occasion, this meeting. There were dishes of pickles and of sliced vegetables, potato chips, and cheese curds. The aunt and uncle were not much older than Lyle and Peg, but they shook their hands all around. And then the mother, Sarah, so young and thin and pale, came out with Shiloh in her arms, all swaddled in a pink blanket. And they could see Sarah was crying, but smiling just the same. And without hesitation, the girl stood immediately beside Peg, and in less than a minute's time, the baby was in Peg's arm, and everyone was crying, including Peg, who would not take her bleary eyes off this little baby, who she knew then, in that instant, was about to become her daughter. If you've lost your spot, we are on chapter 5, and that starts on page 37. Although Lyle had stopped believing, he never really stopped attending church. Indeed, he often suspected he was not alone in this, that millions of Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and Mormons all around the world attended their churches, temples, and mosques, as much out of routine or obligation as out of any real fervor or belief. Or perhaps to model a new dress or hat, a new pair of shoes, or a sharp suit. Guilt, he supposed, must also have played a role, for certainly not every butt in a pew was doing the Lord's work 24/7. Some might secretly be cheating on their taxes, sleeping with a neighbor's wife or husband, playing the casino slot machines or roulette tables with the children's college fund, or who knew what other litany of shortcomings, from the trivial to the criminal. For others, it might be boredom or loneliness. But for Lyle, so much depended on his childhood friend, Pastor Charlie, and that lovely old country church in which he had spent so many Sundays as a child, shuffled into that hard-backed pew by his now long-departed parents. Lyle sometimes heard folks in La Crosse or Eau Claire bemoan urban development, growth, or sprawl as a bad thing, and mostly, he supposed, they were probably right. He wanted to witness farmland or forests being chewed up by roads and parking lots, studded by hastily constructed and offensive-looking buildings. And for many, he imagined the quickest emotion was sadness, rage, or some sort of mourning. But his whole life, Lyle had only ever seen his hometown of Redford, its main street, its stores and restaurants and bars and churches, steadily empty and then shudder before finally falling into disrepair or crumbling back into the earth. And to Lyle, this was more tragic than the advance of commerce, for so much of what he once loved was now gone, and for good. Attending St. Olaf's was a melancholy weekly reminder of his loss, for over the years the hair of the parishioners had grown gray, then white, then disappeared altogether, and over time there were fewer and fewer congregants in the pews, and certainly many fewer children, so that Pastor Charlie's Sunday morning voice felt at once forlorn and defiant in that space, and the pulpit from which he stood more and more flimsy and artificial. Maybe, Lyle had thought, they should just gather in a large circle and talk. And what must Pastor Charlie think, looking out at that long rectangular space, which even 2 decades ago would have been packed, now populated by a few dozen churchgoers? The church could no longer support a secretary, people a choir, or facilitate Sunday school classes. There were fewer than a dozen children sprinkled between the ages of 1 and 18. The service itself had shrunk to a bare 40 minutes, of which a full 15 minutes seemed dedicated to some combination of the welcome, sharing of the peace, whatever announcements, area letfest or lefsa seeds, funerals, bake sales, weather conditions, and the like. And then finally, the closing dismissal. Too soon is coming. At the same time, awfully late. Hard won for just about everyone, it seemed. But Peg and Lyle hung on, and if Lyle had fallen away from his faith, she had long ago seized his wrist, so that even as they both dangled from this crumbling cliff, she would not let him go. She believed for him, and in him, too, somehow. So they went, each Sunday, waking early and drinking their coffee, Peg in a nice dress and Lyle in his threadbare and increasingly tight suit, driving up into the hills where St. Olaf stood proudly, its tall stained glass windows, its stately white steeple, its fieldstone and brick, its wide accepting doors, ancient oaken pews, moldering hymnals and Bibles, and the ever-present aroma of burnt Folgers coffee. Every year, the parking lot's cars and pickup trucks dwindled, and every year, Lyle and Peg seemed to park closer to the church's entrance. Still, Lyle appreciated the routine, appreciated seeing those old codgers and geezers who came out every Sunday in their finest clothing, newly shaved and bathed and perfumed. How deaf many of them had grown. But with their deafness came a new and wonderful intimacy, for Lyle realized that for them to hear him, they had to lean close into his body and he into theirs, right near their overgrown tufts of ear hair, right up to their big bell tones and how those foggies might. After shaking his hand, hold on tight, perhaps trembling, and pull him in close or closer still, like they were sharing the most important secret in the universe, or the combination to an ancient vault holding a fortune in forgotten old gold, silver, and precious jewels. Oh, how Lyle loved those moments of how time slowed for him, how he could see himself years off and into the future, shrunken perhaps, but clinging to a younger person as if to a raft or a tree root, clinging on as the eddies and rapids of a river tugged at his ankles to pull him downstream and over the waterfalls without so much as a jet sand barrel. He and Peg had a pew, a particularly favored pew, where they had sat for what was now decades, close to the pulpit, but not too close, 4 pews from the front on the left. They shared a single hymnal, Lyle holding it between them, and when the gospel was read, Lyle preferred to find the verse in the Bible and follow along, his finger below the printed words, while Peg needed only to listen. And when Pastor Charlie took to the pulpit, Peg would swing a leg over her knee, brushing her foot against Lyle's shin, while he slung an arm behind her shoulders, and there they rested, listening. And if their Saturday night sleep had been fitful, then yes, they might sometimes close their eyes, hoping that the other would, in time, gently elbow them awake in the ribs. Lyle and Charlie had grown up together on neighboring farms, sharing chores, walking to school, playing football, sitting in Sunday school together. It is the most obvious blessing and curse of a small town. Your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, and clergy are forever, it seems, writing in your pocket, staring at you out of their window, intimate enough to intrinsically know when you are happy, sad, distracted, in love, or itching to disappear altogether. In fact, disappear would have been a fairly apt way of describing Charlie's life after graduating from high school. For several years, he worked his way out west, toiling on a rail maintenance cruise for Canadian Pacific until he finally made his way back up to Alaska, where for 2 decades he worked back-breaking jobs, crab boats, salmon canneries, logging, bartending, and a stint placer mining in the bush. Maybe it was that his body could no longer absorb the abuse those jobs doled out, or maybe it was the long, cold, dark, alcoholic winters, or even something else. But in his mid-40s, Charlie drifted back to Wisconsin, entered a seminary, and was more than happy to end up back in Redford at a church the younger seminarians would have had difficulty mustering enthusiasm for. The small salary, the dwindling congregation, the non existent office support, and the church structure itself aging and outdated. But none of these things bothered Charlie in the least. When Charlie reappeared in Redford after so much time away, the two men slipped right back into an easy friendship, the parameters of which had changed over time in relation to their own experiences and responsibilities. For his part, Charlie had become quieter, more reclusive, available on Sundays, to be sure, but otherwise holed up in his home, reading through his shelves of books and listening to his vast collection of vinyl records. This suited Lyle just fine. He had his own family and job, his own life. But when Charlie and Lyle got together for a beer, or perhaps to go out deer hunting together, they fell back into a familiar pattern of quiet and curiosity. Talking about St. Olaf's, about Redford, their family farms, and as the years progressed, the inconvenient and sometimes embarrassing ways in which their bodies were beginning to betray them. Lyle respected his old friend with quiet awe. Charlie had gone and seen the world, worked romantic jobs, called 100 different women his lover. His life was like a Jack London novel, and Lyle never tired of listening to his adventures. Never married, Charlie lived in the church's parsonage, a small brick bungalow half a mile down from St. Olaf's, where he spent most days alone, reading histories of the Civil War, listening to NPR, carving and painting wooden chess pieces, walking the back roads. He was taller and more muscular than Lyle, and he had for years kept a beard, the goatee gone yellow around his lips, thanks to his furtive affairs with old gold cigarettes and white owl cigars. His hair was long and floppy, and in hottest summertime, he occasionally preached wearing Birkenstocks. Jesus, he liked to joke, would have been the ultimate spokesperson for the hippie brand. He carried himself with a detached sort of kindness that seems to inhabit those who have fallen the furthest, suffered the most, and sometimes, frankly, done the most drugs without actually dying. But he never lectured Lyle on religion or faith. And so for years now, hundreds of Sundays, Lyle had sat before his friend, listening to him preach, and what Lyle appreciated most about Charlie's leadership of the church was that he seemed, despite his outsized life, despite his physical size, to be vulnerable. Vulnerable to the elusiveness of faith, certainly, to the difficulty of conviction, to the impossibility of knowing without a shadow of a doubt that this book, this Bible, interpreted, translated, and copied by so many thousands of hands over so many hundreds of years in so many different countries, could possibly convey the pureness, the essence, and undecorated wisdom of God, of the creator of all things. So there were moments at the pulpit when Charlie would lower his head and pause for 5, 10, 20 seconds, and Lyle might lean gently forward as if he might need to rescue his friend from a lapse in faith. But then Charlie would look up, stroking or perhaps scratching his beard, and smile at the congregation and simply say in a voice like early morning loose gravel, "I apologize. Sometimes my record just seems to skip and I need to move the needle a little, find a new groove." If you've lost your spot, we are on the top of page 44. His congregation adored him because they too sensed in him old faults and flaws. They saw in him themselves. There were no sharp corners left on Charlie, only rounded edges, like those smooth river stones a person plucks from the moving water and keeps in their pocket, or on a bookshelf, rubbing it between their fingers like a talisman or a lucky charm. After church, he would stand at the entrance to the narthex and shake everyone's hand, addressing everyone by name, and in any season other than winter, the door would be wide open and Charlie's squinted eyes would show his wrinkles. And 45 minutes later, you might find him behind the church, sitting on an old metal folding chair, his legs casually crossed, looking out over the Cooley lands, smoking a cigarette, his robes, no doubt, hanging inside, but his white collar still in place. This Sunday, Shiloh and Isaac came with Lyle and Peg to St. Olaf's, and their presence was like that of two long-journeyed astronauts or explorers to the old people who came to them in their pew to hug Shiloh and tussle Isaac's hair. What a joy it was for Lyle to parade these two people he loved so much and felt such pride in, to sit in church together, as he had with Shiloh so many years ago, when she was just a girl, small enough to fit below his armpit, where she would read a box for children, or perhaps her cherished Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose little house in the big woods was not so very far from their own little town. Shiloh and Charlie delighted in talking to each other, and it was Lyle's friend, more than anyone else, who could coax details from her, bits of her biography she'd never shared with her parents, religious texts she'd studied, theological scholars she sought out, service trips to tornado-torn or hurricane-battered communities, ex-boyfriends, jobs. This whole life she only sometimes showed her parents, even if generally she was polite, respectful, and reserved. After church, they piled into Peg's trusty Subaru wagon and drove back to Redford, where Shiloh prepared a brunch of fresh fruit, sausage patties, and eggs, as Lyle pushed Isaac on the backyard swing. A plank of gray, weathered wood suspended by two ropes anchored into a wide, expansive oak branch at the back of their little property. Isaac could swing for hours, and Lyle, for his part, enjoyed the metronomic rhythm of it all, the tree's gentle protestations, the scratchy harmonics of the ropes, and the boys' endless chitter-chatter. Everything from an incomplete attempt at a summary of Charlie's sermon to yesterday morning's cartoons, to questions ranging from the biblical to theological, physics, and the brass tacks of evolution, all the way back to favorite colors and pizza toppings. Grandpa, if we were descended from gorillas and monkeys, then does that mean that Adam and Eve were descended from gorillas and monkeys? Were they, Adam and Eve, more like gorillas or more like us? Or is that just like a story? And if Adam and Eve were the first two people, did they start off as grown-ups? I mean, were they ever children? Wouldn't that be cool if once we were all children? Just two children on the whole planet. And then an immediate seg. Grandpa, where is heaven? Is it in the clouds or like past the clouds in outer space? And if it's in the clouds, what happens on a sunny day? Where does heaven go? And why can't we see the people up in heaven? How the boy could ask questions exhaustively, relentlessly, so sincerely for hours at a time. Church filled Isaac's little head with glorious puzzles and promises, and afterward, it was often left to Lyle to delicately untangle the knots, always careful not to cut the line that Shiloh had carefully and skillfully secured around herself and Isaac. The world is filled with a near endless array of mysteries and an even more infinite amount of guesses, grifts, lies, steals, and here and there, almost hidden, a very few sacred handfuls of answers. Increasingly, Lyle found that he was most at home in the quiet, near those he loved, not trying to solve any problems or answer any questions, but rather just learning how to live more lightly, love more intensely, eat better, and before his eyes closed at night, to read through the shelves and shelves of books that sadly he knew he would likely never live long enough to open. Those white-winged birds perched on his chest in the pale light of his bedside lamp, waiting for their thin pages to be flicked lightly by a wet fingertip and turned, giving over their stories and poems and mythologies. Increasingly, and in direct contrast to his lust for books, Lau found that he loved nothing more than a good cat nap, stealing sleep the way a child steals a quarter off the counter, a small, insignificant, but thrilling theft. And that is the end of chapter 5. So I will see you back next time for chapter 6.